The night settles softly over the hills of ancient Latium, and a gentle veil of mist rises from the quiet waters of the Tiber. River. The stars seem to linger above the landscape with patient curiosity, watching over fields where sheep once wandered, and where the songs of distant shepherds drifted through cool evening air. Before marble temples reached toward the heavens, and before roads stretched across continents, there was only the whisper of reeds along the riverbank and the silent promise that these 7 hills held a destiny unlike any other. In that peaceful world, where myth and memory blend like moonlight upon moving water, the story of Rome begins, with 2 small children whose names would echo through thousands of years, Romulus and Remus, according to the cherished legend, were placed upon the river, carried gently by its currents, as though guided by unseen hands. Their fragile cradle drifted until it rested beneath the shelter of a fig tree, where the earth itself seemed to welcome them into its embrace. There, beneath the quiet canopy of leaves, a she-wolf approached. Yet, instead of danger, the tale speaks of care and unexpected tenderness. The wild creature offered warmth and protection, allowing the abandoned twins to survive until they could be found by humble shepherds. As breezes stirred the grasses around the cave, generations later would remember the image of the wolf as a symbol not only of survival, but of the mysterious ways in which fate sometimes chooses unlikely guardians. The twins grew among rolling pastures and rocky slopes where olive trees caught the morning sun and cypress shadows stretched across the land. They learned the rhythms of the seasons, the patience of tending flocks, and the quiet wisdom carried by elders around glowing hearth fires. Even in those modest surroundings, stories whispered that greatness rested upon their shoulders, though no one could yet know the form it would take. As the years unfolded like the slow turning of leaves in autumn, the brothers looked toward the hills overlooking the Tiber and imagined a place where people might gather in safety and hope. Tradition tells of disagreement over signs from the heavens, a sorrowful division that forever shaped the legend. Yet, beyond the sadness, lies the enduring image of one brother, standing upon a hilltop, gazing over valleys silvered by dawn, determined to establish a city whose future seemed written into the very stones beneath his feet. Romulus became the founder, tracing the first boundaries of the settlement upon the earth. One can imagine the placing of rough-cut stones, the sound of wooden tools against soil, and quiet conversations between families who believed they were creating something lasting. Smoke from cooking fires rose into the evening sky, mingling with the scent of herbs, while children played along paths that would one day become famous streets. The settlement was simple. Huts with thatched roofs clustered upon the Palatine Hill, built from timber and clay rather than polished marble. Goats wandered nearby, baskets overflowed with grain, and water was carried from springs, whose gentle trickling echoed through shaded groves. Yet within these ordinary scenes rested extraordinary ambition, for every generation added another layer to the foundation. much as rings quietly gather within the heart of an ancient tree. Time moved onward with remarkable calm, and the memory of Romulus became part of a larger procession of kings. Numa Pompilius encouraged sacred rituals and peaceful order, inviting people to honor the unseen forces guiding the world. Under his influence, temples became places where silence carried deep meaning. Other kings oversaw bridges spanning gentle currents, marketplaces alive with conversation, and expanding walls. Craftsmen carved wood, potters shaped clay, and the city absorbed each influence gradually, like fertile soil accepting seeds born by winds. The 7 hills watched over every generation, glowing softly beneath sunrise or fading into violet dusk. Aventine, Capitoline, Caelian, Esquiline, Palatine, Quirinal, and Viminal caught the changing light, echoing the ordinary moments that formed the heartbeat of the young city. As centuries drifted onward, Rome became a community bound by laws and shared memory. Yet with growth came heavier burdens. The final king, Tarquin the Proud, stands at the edge of this story like the last glow of sunset. Around him gathered tensions that would gently close this chapter. The Age of Kings started with an abandoned cradle and a shepherd's fire, approached its conclusion. Beyond the horizon, a different vision waited to awaken. A republic that would carry the name of Rome into ages yet undreamed. As the seasons continued their patient journey across the 7 hills, Rome found itself standing between memory and transformation. The huts of the earliest settlers had slowly given way to stronger buildings. Pathways had become well-worn streets, and the voices that once belonged only to shepherds now mingled with merchants, craftsmen, priests, and travelers from distant lands. Yet beneath the quiet rhythm of daily life, another current flowed unseen, like deep water moving beneath the surface of the Tiber. The reign of Tarquin the Proud settled over the city like a heavy evening fog. Ancient storytellers would remember him as a ruler who placed great confidence in his own judgment and little in the shared counsel of others. Magnificent works continued to rise from stone and timber, but alongside them grew a quiet feeling that Rome itself was becoming larger than the will of any single person. Citizens carried this thought silently through markets and workshops, pondering it beneath olive trees and around glowing hearths as twilight painted the hills in shades of violet and gold. When darkness fell, torches flickered against weathered walls, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the unfinished forum. The air remained calm, scented with smoke from cooking fires and fresh bread cooling on wooden tables. Yet conversations became more reflective. Elders spoke of duty. Young people wondered what kind of city they wished to inherit. The stars above appeared unchanged, but below them, hearts were slowly shifting toward a new understanding. History remembers one name rising gently from this turning tide: Lucius Junius Brutus. Rather than appearing as a figure of thunder or spectacle, he can be imagined standing quietly among fellow Romans, listening more than speaking, observing the concerns carried in ordinary voices. In the measured pace of tradition, Brutus came to embody the belief that a community should not rest entirely in the hands of one ruler, but should instead be entrusted to laws, customs, and shared responsibility. The decisive moment arrived not as an explosion of noise, but as a collective awakening that seemed to pass through the city like the first breeze before dawn. Families looked toward their neighbors with renewed purpose. Senators, magistrates, soldiers, and laborers alike recognized that Rome's future might be shaped through cooperation rather than absolute command. It was as though the 7 hills themselves, silent witnesses to generations of change, had patiently waited for this realization to blossom. Ancient tradition tells that an oath was sworn, solemn and enduring, promising that no king would again hold dominion over Rome. One may picture the gathering beneath an open sky, where cool morning air drifted from the river and settled over assembled citizens. Torches burned low as night surrendered to the first pale hints of sunrise. Faces reflected determination rather than anger, and voices carried the weight of remembrance rather than the heat of passion. The promise they made was not merely against one individual, but in favor of an idea that seemed larger than any person could ever become. That idea would come to be known as res publica, the public matter, the shared commonwealth belonging to the people themselves. It lived within the agreements of neighbors, the fairness of laws, and the willingness of citizens to place collective well-being above personal ambition. With the monarchy set aside, Rome entered unfamiliar territory. Instead of elevating a new king, authority was divided among elected magistrates who would serve for limited periods, ensuring that leadership remained temporary and accountable. This rhythm of shared governance reflected the cycles of nature itself, where seasons change and rivers flow onward. The Senate assumed renewed importance as a gathering of experienced voices, offering counsel and continuity. Within its solemn assemblies, older men, draped in simple garments, discussed questions that would shape the city's future. The chamber echoed with measured deliberation, where pauses often carried as much significance as spoken words. The forum gradually transformed into the living heart of this young republic. At first, it remained modest, but each sunrise filled it with quiet purpose. Merchants arranged baskets of olives and grain, while officials settled disputes. Children followed their parents through its open spaces, and the sound of sandals upon worn ground blended with the murmur of civic life. The Tiber continued its endless journey beside the city, unconcerned with titles. Morning mist still rose from its waters, softening bridges and riverbanks. Throughout the hills, sacred fires continued to burn in homes where generations gathered, at day's end, stepping carefully toward a different future. Then, at last, another dawn arrived. Golden light spilled gently across the forum, climbed the slopes of the 7 hills, and shimmered upon the calm surface of the Tiber. Citizens emerged to begin their ordinary tasks. In that peaceful morning glow, the words res publica seemed less like a political invention and more like the first rays of sunlight after a long and thoughtful night, a promise that Rome was now a shared endeavor, Entrusted to many hands, the first light of morning spread quietly across the rooftops of Rome, touching the tiled houses, temple columns, and winding streets with a soft, golden glow. From the crest of the Palatine Hill, one could look outward and see a land that seemed to breathe with calm purpose. Fields of wheat shimmered in the breeze. Vineyards climbed gentle slopes, and distant villages rested beneath clusters of cypress and olive trees. The Republic, still young in the memory of its people, had begun to stretch beyond the familiar embrace of the Seven Hills, carrying its customs and institutions into the wider landscapes of Italy. The passage of expansion was not like the sudden bloom of a flower, but, rather, the steady growth of an ancient oak, adding one quiet ring after another through countless seasons. Roads were laid stone by stone across valleys and ridges, their carefully fitted surfaces guiding travelers, merchants, and officials through territories that gradually became linked by shared agreements and mutual obligations. Watchtowers rose on lonely hilltops where shepherds once stood alone, their silhouettes watching over fertile plains washed in the silver light of dawn. As generations passed, neighboring communities found themselves woven into a larger tapestry. Some entered willingly through alliance, others after periods of uncertainty, but over time, the Italian peninsula became increasingly connected by roads, marketplaces, and laws that reached outward. From Rome, like gentle streams feeding into a mighty river, farmers carried grain to expanding towns. Blacksmiths shaped tools beside glowing furnaces, and children born in distant valleys grew up, hearing stories of the Senate and the Forum as though they belonged to them as well. The Mediterranean Sea shimmered endlessly beyond the western horizon. Sailors called it simply the Great Water, where sunlight danced across blue waves from morning until evening, and where ships drifted between islands, carried by patient winds. Across those glittering waters stood Carthage, a magnificent maritime power whose wealth flowed through bustling ports. Filled with merchants, palm trees swayed gently above white stone buildings, while sails rose and fell like seabirds settling upon calm waves. Carthage and Rome, though separated by the sea, slowly became aware that their ambitions were beginning to overlap. The meeting of these two republics unfolded as the slow approach of two tides upon the same shore. Historians would later call their prolonged rivalry the Punic Wars. Yet for those living through the years, life continued in ordinary rhythms. Among the names preserved by history, few inspire the imagination as deeply as Hannibal Barca. He emerged from Carthage as a commander whose journey across nature itself became legendary. His ambition led him toward an extraordinary route, one that wound through forests, rivers, and towering mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. Imagine the Alps, not as obstacles, but as immense, sleeping giants draped in snow and silence. Their peaks reflected pale morning light, while icy winds whispered through narrow passes, carved over countless ages. In that breathtaking landscape, Hannibal's long procession advanced with patient determination. Soldiers, wrapped in cloaks, moved carefully along narrow trails, where every step echoed against stone. Most astonishing of all were the elephants, enormous silhouettes emerging through curtains of mist, as though ancient spirits had wandered into the mountains themselves. Their measured footsteps left broad impressions in fresh snow, and their quiet breath drifted into the alpine air like clouds meeting the earth. The Mediterranean Sea shimmered endlessly beyond the western horizon. Sailors called it simply the Great Water, where sunlight danced across blue waves from morning until evening, and where ships drifted between islands, carried by patient winds. Across those glittering waters stood Carthage, a magnificent maritime power, whose wealth flowed through bustling ports. Filled with merchants, palm trees swayed gently above white stone buildings, while sails rose and fell like seabirds settling upon calm waves. Carthage and Rome, though separated by the sea, slowly became aware that their ambitions were beginning to overlap. The meeting of these two republics unfolded as the slow approach of two tides upon the same shore. Historians would later call their prolonged rivalry the Punic Wars. Yet for those living through the years, life continued in ordinary rhythms. Among the names preserved by history, few inspire the imagination as deeply as Hannibal Barca. He emerged from Carthage as a commander whose journey across nature itself became legendary. His ambition led him toward an extraordinary route, one that wound through forests, rivers, and towering mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. Imagine the Alps not as obstacles, but as immense, sleeping giants draped in snow and silence. Their peaks reflected pale morning light, while icy winds whispered through narrow passes, carved over countless ages. In that breathtaking landscape, Hannibal's long procession advanced with patient determination. Soldiers wrapped in cloaks moved carefully along narrow trails where every step echoed against stone. Most astonishing of all were the elephants, enormous silhouettes emerging through curtains of mist, as though ancient spirits had wandered into the mountains themselves. Their measured footsteps left broad impressions in fresh snow, and their quiet breath drifted into the alpine air like clouds meeting the earth. As the generations continued their quiet procession beneath the changing constellations, Rome found itself transformed by the very success it had so patiently pursued. The republic that had once stretched only across the nearby hills now reached from one end of the Italian peninsula to the other, its influence carried by roads that shimmered in the midday heat and ships that crossed the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean. Wealth flowed steadily into the city like rivers after spring rains, filling treasuries, adorning villas, and bringing objects of remarkable beauty from distant lands. Yet prosperity, like sunlight falling unevenly across a hillside, did not warm every corner in the same way. Beyond the marble buildings and crowded marketplaces, the countryside itself was changing. Small farms that had long been tended by generations of families slowly disappeared into vast, estates owned by influential households. The golden wheat fields still rippled beneath the breeze, exactly as they always had. But many of the hands that harvested them no longer belonged to independent farmers, whose ancestors had walked those same paths. In the early morning, when dew rested upon the grain, and birds sang from olive branches, abandoned cottages, standing quietly at the edges of immense properties, stone wells remained where they had always been. Ivy climbed over familiar walls, and fig trees continued to bear fruit each summer. Yet many of the people who once called these places home had drifted toward the expanding city in search of opportunity. Time altered landscapes gently, leaving traces of old lives hidden beneath new arrangements. Thoughtful voices began to wonder whether balance could be restored. Among those remembered by history were two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, centuries as symbols of reform and concern for ordinary citizens. Their hopes rested not in spectacle, but in the belief that land, law, and public life could better serve the broader community. They looked across the Republic and imagined fields once again supporting families whose roots reached deep into Italian soil. The story of the Gracchi carries a quiet melancholy, for sincere aspirations often encounter resistance when societies stand at moments of profound change. Even so, their memory endured because they gave voice to questions that many quietly carried within themselves. Around household hearths and beneath shaded porticos, Romans reflected upon fairness, responsibility, and the meaning of shared prosperity. Their conversations drifted through narrow streets like evening breezes, subtle yet persistent. While these debates unfolded in the capital, another chapter of history was taking shape farther south in the fertile lands of Campania. There, near the ancient city of Capua, Mount Vesuvius rose with silent majesty above vineyards and orchards. Its broad slopes appeared peaceful beneath changing skies, clothed in forests and fertile earth. In its shadow stood training schools where gladiators lived disciplined lives, preparing for public spectacles that fascinated Roman audiences. It is here that history introduces Spartacus, remembered not merely for defiance, but for an enduring desire that transcends ages, the wish to live freely beneath an open sky. Rather than imagining him through moments of conflict, one may picture him during quieter hours, gazing toward distant hills where the evening sun softened every ridge into shades of amber and violet. Perhaps, like countless travelers before him, he wondered what lay beyond the horizon and dreamed of returning to a place he could truly call home. Within the walls of Capua, daily routines followed measured rhythms. Morning light entered courtyards where footsteps echoed against stone, while instructors and laborers moved through familiar tasks. Beyond those walls stretched fields heavy with grain and orchards, scented with ripening fruit. The contrast between enclosure and open countryside may have deepened the longing shared by many who lived there. A quiet yearning carried silently from one sunrise to the next. When Spartacus and others eventually departed from Capua, their path led toward the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. The ascent unfolded through forests, where birds nested among ancient branches, and cool breezes carried the fragrance of pine and wild herbs. Higher still, the world opened into broad vistas, overlooking fields, villages, and winding roads that disappeared into hazy distances. From such heights, human dispute seemed remarkably small beside the enduring presence of mountains and sky. As night descended upon the volcanic slopes, campfires flickered gently against the darkness like scattered stars brought down to earth. Around those modest flames gathered people from many backgrounds, each carrying memories of distant homes or families left behind. Conversations softened into whispers while sparks drifted upward to join the constellations overhead. In those quiet hours, the dream of freedom likely appeared less as an abstract ideal and more as something wonderfully simple, the chance to choose one's own path beneath the heavens. The encampments themselves became temporary villages, shaped by necessity and hope. Water was gathered from springs hidden among rocks. Meals were prepared over glowing embers, and blankets were spread beneath. Trees whose roots had gripped the mountain for centuries. Dawn arrived each morning with remarkable serenity, painting the eastern horizon in pale gold, while mist lingered in valleys below. For a brief moment before the day's uncertainties resumed, the mountain belonged only to birdsong, cool air, and silent contemplation. The movement associated with Spartacus ultimately came to its conclusion, yet the longing for dignity and belonging remained woven into the larger story of Rome itself. When the roads of Italy settled once more into peaceful routine, merchants resumed their journeys. Shepherds guided flocks across familiar hillsides, and farmers returned to fields glowing beneath the summer sun. The Republic endured, though not unchanged. Invisible questions about wealth, citizenship, and justice lingered like echoes among temple columns and senate halls. Night settled quietly across the northern frontier, where the final stars shimmered above distant forests and rivers that had witnessed years of long campaigns. The winds carried the scent of pine and damp earth, whispering through the tents of soldiers preparing for another journey. Among them stood Julius Caesar, a figure whose name had already begun to travel farther than the roads of Rome themselves, returning from lands where mist-covered valleys and broad rivers stretched beneath unfamiliar skies. The path before him led not through towering mountains or vast seas, but toward a modest stream known as the Rubicon. By ordinary measure, it was small, its waters flowing gently over rounded stones with little concern for the affairs of mankind. Yet history has a curious habit of placing immense consequences upon the quietest landscapes. Beneath the cool light of the moon, the narrow river reflected scattered stars, turning its surface into a ribbon of silver winding through the sleeping countryside. One may imagine Caesar pausing there in thoughtful silence. Around him, the soft clicking of armor accompanied the restless shifting of horses, while cloaked figures waited patiently beneath ancient trees. No loud declarations disturbed the stillness, only the murmur of moving water and the occasional rustle of wind through bare branches marked the passing moments. It was a place where reflection seemed almost unavoidable. For once, the crossing was made. When the first careful footsteps entered the stream, the ripples spread outward in widening circles, disappearing into darkness as though carrying invisible messages toward the sea. Soldiers followed in measured order, their lanterns casting trembling reflections that drifted across the current. The crossing itself was simple, almost gentle, yet its meaning reached beyond the quiet banks into the heart of the Republic. A single night's decision would become one of history's enduring symbols, reminding future generations that great transformations often begin with an ordinary step. As dawn slowly unfolded, Rome itself awaited beneath pale skies washed with soft morning light. The city had grown magnificent through centuries of patient labor. Marble temples gleamed upon the hills, markets filled with voices from every corner of the Mediterranean, and aqueducts carried fresh water with remarkable precision. Senators walked beneath colonnades polished smooth by countless footsteps, while scribes copied laws onto scrolls that preserved the memory of earlier generations. Into this grand setting came Caesar, whose reputation blended military accomplishment with political ambition and remarkable personal charisma. Crowds gathered along streets where flower petals drifted through the air, while craftsmen paused their work to observe passing processions. Yet beneath outward celebration lingered quieter questions about the future. Rome had become immense, and with greatness came uncertainty about how such a vast republic could continue to govern itself according to traditions formed in far simpler times. The months that followed carried an atmosphere of both brilliance and weariness. Public squares remained lively from sunrise until evening, but thoughtful observers sensed invisible currents shifting beneath familiar routines. Libraries filled with scholars discussing philosophy, merchants negotiated beneath colorful awnings, and priests tended sacred fires. At the same time, conversations increasingly turned toward power, authority, and whether one extraordinary individual might overshadow institutions patiently built across centuries. Caesar accepted honors that reflected his extraordinary position, overseeing reforms and projects intended to shape Rome's future. Yet grandeur often casts long shadows. In quiet villas and secluded gardens, groups of senators met beneath flickering lamps whose flames bent gently whenever evening breezes slipped through open courtyards. Their discussions unfolded in restrained voices, marked less by anger than by profound concern. For the traditions they believed defined the Republic. As winter yielded to spring, subtle signs seemed to gather across the city. Gentle morning rain washed dust from statues standing in public squares, leaving polished stone glistening beneath gray skies. Even the echoes of footsteps beneath vaulted ceilings appeared softer than usual, as though Rome itself sensed that an important chapter was nearing its conclusion. Then came the day remembered as the Ides of March. The air carried the cool freshness that follows early rainfall, and droplets lingered upon laurel leaves, lining quiet pathways. Caesar walked toward the Senate meeting, passing familiar buildings whose columns cast long shadows across worn pavement. The Curia awaited him with its austere dignity, its spacious interior filled with cold marble surfaces that reflected faint light filtering through high openings. Inside, sandals echoed against polished floors, while senators gathered among statues, honoring figures from earlier ages. Time itself seemed to slow within those walls, every movement acquiring unusual weight, every silence deepening into contemplation. The moment that followed entered history as a profound tragedy, not only for one man, but for an entire political order. Rather than imagining confusion or noise, one may picture the vast chamber becoming strangely still, its marble figures standing as silent witnesses while destiny completed its patient work. Outside, clouds drifted slowly apart, allowing sunlight to break through in widening beams that illuminated rooftops, gardens, and the flowing waters of the Tiber. As afternoon advanced, golden light entered the Senate hall through high windows, stretching across the empty floor until it reached the feet of ancient statues worn, smoothed by passing centuries. Dust drifted lazily through the warm beams, rising and falling with currents too delicate to see. The Republic, shaped by generations of debate, sacrifice, and shared governance, did not vanish in a single instant. Instead, it seemed to settle softly into memory, like an old storyteller closing weary eyes at the end of a long tale. When the long echoes of civil conflict at last faded into memory, Rome seemed to breathe again with a quiet and measured rhythm. Dust settled upon roads that had carried marching columns. Olive branches swayed gently in the returning breeze, and the waters of the Tiber reflected clear skies once more. Across the 7 hills, craftsmen reopened workshops. Merchants unfolded bright fabrics beneath shaded arcades, and the familiar sounds of hammers, footsteps, and distant conversation returned like birds after a passing storm. From this atmosphere of cautious renewal emerged Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, a young leader whose patient determination would shape an entirely new age. In time, he accepted the honorific name Augustus, a title suggesting dignity and reverence rather than simple authority. It seemed fitting for an era that sought not only power but also restoration, inviting the weary republic to rest, while quietly giving birth to something lasting. One can imagine Augustus walking through the streets in the soft light of morning, observing buildings worn by centuries of wind and rain, listening to the murmur of fountains and the distant bells of workshops. Beginning another day, his vision extended beyond immediate triumphs toward the careful rebuilding of a city whose influence reached farther. With every passing year, stone by stone, column by column, Rome itself became a canvas upon which stability could be expressed through architecture. Generations later, tradition would preserve his famous reflection that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. Whether spoken with pride or quiet satisfaction, The sentiment captures the remarkable transformation that unfolded during his reign. Temples rose with gleaming facades that caught the midday sun until they appeared almost luminous. Porticos stretched gracefully along public squares, where cool shadows offered shelter from the afternoon warmth. Polished columns reflected light in subtle patterns that shifted as clouds drifted overhead. Everywhere, water became a symbol of quiet prosperity. New aqueducts carried clear streams across valleys and into the heart of cities through carefully engineered channels of limestone and stone. Their arches marched across the countryside with calm confidence, spanning rivers and fields in elegant succession. Beneath them, shepherds guided flocks through green pastures, while simple melodies floated from wooden flutes, mingling with the rhythmic splash of water, descending into fountains, where children paused to cool their hands. Rome itself blossomed into a place where practical purpose met artistic beauty. Markets filled with baskets of figs, olives, grain, and fragrant herbs. Sculptors patiently shaped marble until lifelike expressions emerged from pale stone. Scribes bent over smooth parchment, dipping reed pens into dark ink as they copied histories, laws, and verses of poetry. Beyond Italy, the vast network of provinces gradually settled into a remarkable period remembered as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. These centuries became known for relative stability across an immense territory stretching around much of the Mediterranean world. Roads connected mountain villages with bustling ports, deserts with fertile plains, and distant cultures with the heart of the empire. Imagine a traveler setting out at sunrise along one of these carefully paved roads. His sandals strike smooth stones worn by countless journeys before his own, while cypress trees line portions of the route and wildflowers bloom between ancient milestones. He carries letters, perhaps goods for trade, or simply curiosity about lands beyond the next ridge. Inns await him at measured intervals. Bridges span rivers with reassuring solidity, and each evening he finds shelter beneath roofs maintained by communities, linked through shared administration and commerce. The Mediterranean itself seems transformed into a broad avenue of calm exchange. Merchant ships glide steadily across blue waters, their sails billowing softly beneath favorable winds. Cargoes of pottery, grain, papyrus, glassware, spices, and textiles move from harbor to harbor with graceful predictability. Dolphins sometimes appear beside the hulls, while gulls circle overhead, and sunlight dances upon gentle waves. Sailors navigate by familiar stars, trusting both the heavens above and the established ports awaiting them below. Within Rome, evenings unfold with quiet elegance. Citizens stroll through gardens where fountains murmur among carefully arranged flowers. The marble of temples cools after absorbing the day's warmth, taking on delicate shades of ivory beneath the fading sun. Lanterns glow softly beneath colonnades, while musicians play gentle melodies that drift into open courtyards scented with rosemary and laurel. Above, the first stars emerge one by one, just as they did in the days of Romulus, though now they shine over a city transformed beyond recognition. As the decades pass, stone roads weather beneath countless journeys, but remain steadfast. Aqueducts continue their silent labor day and night. Olive groves deepen their roots. Vineyards expand across sunny hillsides, and fishing boats depart before dawn, exactly as they did the day before. At last, twilight descends over the Mediterranean basin with extraordinary gentleness. Along distant frontiers, watchfires burn quietly beneath vast skies. Merchant vessels rest safely in sheltered harbors, where their masts sway almost imperceptibly with the tide. Beneath that immense celestial canopy, the Pax Romana settles into the world like a long, peaceful exhalation. The roads are quiet, the borders watchful yet calm, and the sea reflects the moon in gentle silver ribbons. The centuries drifted onward, with the quiet certainty of a river flowing toward the sea, carrying with them the voices of emperors, merchants, poets, shepherds, and countless ordinary families whose names were never carved into marble, yet whose footsteps shaped the life of Rome. The great city still stood upon its 7 hills, crowned by temples and towers that glowed softly in the morning sun. But time, patient and unhurried, had begun its gentle work. Nothing changed all at once. Instead, the vast edges of the Western Empire slowly softened, like distant mountains fading into evening mist. Along remote frontiers, watchtowers continued to greet each sunrise, though the lands they overlooked became quieter and less certain. Roads that had once carried endless caravans and official messengers now welcomed fewer travelers, their smooth stones warmed by the same sunlight that had touched them for generations. Grass appeared between carefully fitted blocks, first as tiny green threads, and then as resilient patches that seemed to whisper that nature, too, had always been part of Rome's long story. The empire did not simply vanish beneath a single shadow. It aged with dignity, much like an old scholar who closes a cherished book after many years of reading. Provinces gradually followed their own paths. Local customs grew stronger, and distant cities developed lives increasingly independent from the capital. The immense web that had once stretched across continents loosened strand by strand, not with sudden violence, but with the quiet acceptance that every season eventually yields to the next. Rome itself seemed less like a defeated city than a weary traveler returning home after an unimaginably long journey. It had crossed mountains and seas, built roads through forests and deserts, and connected peoples separated by language and landscape. Now it rested, breathing more slowly, allowing silence to settle where once there had been endless movement. The Tiber continued its faithful passage beneath ancient bridges, reflecting pale dawns and silver moons, without concern for politics or power. As years became generations, ivy discovered forgotten corners of marble walls. Delicate tendrils climbed columns that had once supported magnificent porticos, wrapping cool stone in living green. Wild flowers rooted themselves beside cracked pavements, their blossoms nodding gently whenever warm. Breezes wandered through abandoned courtyards. The transformation was not one of destruction, but of quiet companionship, as though nature had come to sit beside the old monuments and keep them company through the passing ages. The Forum, once alive with debates, announcements, and processions, gradually embraced a different kind of stillness. Sunlight continued to pour across its open spaces each afternoon, tracing familiar paths over worn steps and weathered statues. Birds nested among ledges where magistrates had once stood, and soft winds carried the fragrance of rosemary and distant pine into places where scrolls and speeches had once shaped history. Silence itself became another resident of the ancient square. Far above, the aqueduct still crossed valleys with elegant confidence, their arches framing changing skies exactly as they had centuries before. In the quiet hours before dawn, owls found shelter within their cool stone recesses, watching over sleeping fields while stars slowly turned overhead. Dew gathered upon wild grasses beneath the arches, sparkling briefly in first light before disappearing into the warmth of morning. The remarkable truth was that Rome's influence never rested solely within its walls. Its legal ideas quietly shaped distant societies. Its language evolved into new voices spoken across valleys, islands, and coastlines. Nothing essential was truly lost. The engineering endured wherever clear water flowed through carefully measured channels. Rome's legacy became less like an object that could crumble and more like a melody that changes instruments yet continues to be heard. Meanwhile, the city itself entered a peaceful dialogue with the landscape around it. Soft night mist rose from the Tiber and drifted through ancient streets before dissolving beneath the first rays of sunrise. Moss settled into shaded crevices where rainwater lingered after gentle showers. Marble, once dazzling white, mellowed into warm tones, touched by countless sunsets, acquiring a beauty born not of perfection, but of endurance. As evening approached, the hills surrounding the city glowed amber, before, gradually, fading into lavender and blue. The final swallows crossed the river in graceful arcs, disappearing into nests tucked beneath old rooftops. Lanterns appeared one by one in windows overlooking narrow lanes, while distant music floated gently through cooling air, scented with olive wood and jasmine. The entire landscape seemed to exhale, surrendering itself to the calm embrace of approaching night. Then darkness settled completely, revealing, once more, the eternal constellations that had watched over Romulus and Remus, the early kings, the Senate, Hannibal's distant march, Caesar's fateful decisions, Augustus's peaceful reforms, and every generation that followed. The stars remained unchanged, brilliant points of quiet light suspended above Italy, reflecting softly in the patient waters of the Tiber and upon stones worn smooth by 2 millennia of footsteps. If one could imagine the camera slowly rising above the sleeping city, climbing beyond rooftops and cypress groves into the cool stillness of the night, Rome would appear not as a ruin, abandoned by history, but as a timeless presence resting within it. The Forum would become a gentle silhouette, and the marble monuments would merge with the hills, from which their stone was first drawn. The music would soften until only the whisper of wind and river remained. At last, even those sounds would give way to silence, while beneath the endless stars, the eternal city rested like an unbroken stone upon the earth, its long journey complete, its memory secure, and its story continuing forever. In the quiet dreams of those who look up at the night sky